Most men never find out. They go to their graves believing a lie. They kiss their wife good morning, sit across from her at dinner, hold her hand at church, and carry that lie all the way to the end, never knowing, never suspecting, never even coming close to the truth. And in some ways, maybe that's a mercy, because what I'm about to tell you is the story of a man who did find out. Not from a text message, not from a whispered rumor passed through a mutual friend, not from a receipt left in a coat pocket or a name that came up one too many times in conversation. He found out the way that breaks a man at the cellular level, with his own two eyes standing in the dark, in complete silence, watching everything he had ever trusted dissolve right in front of him. And the most devastating part of all of it, the part that still stays with me long after I first heard this story, is that she had absolutely no idea he was there. She thought she was alone. She thought she was safe. She thought the secret she had been carrying for nearly 2 years was still perfectly intact. And he stood there, in the shadows of his own home, watching her live a life he knew nothing about. And he made a decision in that moment that most men would never have the composure to make. He didn't kick the door in. He didn't scream. He didn't confront her. He turned around, walked back to his car, and he sat in that driveway in total darkness for 2 hours without making a single sound. And what he did after those 2 hours, the slow, quiet, methodical way he handled what he had seen, is the reason we are here today. Because this is not just a story about betrayal. This is a story about what a man does when the floor falls out from underneath him. This is a story about silence as a weapon, patience as a form of power, and the moment when everything a person thought they knew about their own life turns out to be a carefully constructed fiction. Before we go any further, and I promise you, this story goes to places you will not see coming, I want to ask you something. And I want you to sit with the question honestly. If you were standing in that driveway, if you were the one who had just seen what this man saw, what would you do? Because the answer you give right now, before you know everything, and the answer you give at the end of this video after you hear how this story ends, may be 2 very different answers. And that difference, that gap between who you think you are and who you actually are under pressure, that is exactly what this story is about. Before we go deeper into that night, before we get to what he saw and what he did and how this entire thing ultimately unraveled in ways that nobody in this story expected, you need to understand who these people were. Because this is not a story about a broken marriage between 2 people who had already given up. This is not a story about a couple who had been sleeping in separate rooms for years, or 2 people who had stopped speaking, or a marriage that had already quietly rotted from the inside out. This is a story about a marriage that, on every surface level, looked completely fine. And that is what makes it so hard to process. That is what makes it linger. Because when a marriage that looks fine, truly fine, from the outside to the neighbors, to the kids, to the extended family at Christmas dinner, turns out to be something else entirely underneath, it raises a question that is deeply uncomfortable to ask. How well do we ever really know the person sleeping next to us? How much of the life we believe we are living is real, and how much of it is a version of reality that somebody else has carefully constructed for us? There are 3 questions at the center of this story, and I want you to hold on to all 3 of them as we go. The first question is this: how does a man sit across from his wife at the breakfast table the morning after he has seen everything and say nothing? The second question is, who was the other man, and what was his connection to this family? Because when that detail comes out, and it will come out, it changes the entire shape of the story. And the third question, the one that I think is the most important and the most difficult to answer, when the full truth finally came to the surface, when every card was on the table and every lie had been accounted for, who in this story was actually the villain? Because I will tell you right now, by the time we reach the end, you may not be entirely sure. And that uncertainty is going to be deeply uncomfortable, but it is also the most honest part of everything I am about to tell you. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let me tell you about a man named Thomas, and the life he thought he had. Thomas was 51 years old when his world came apart. He was a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm out of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of company that builds the schools and the municipal buildings and the county roads that most people use every day without ever thinking about who put them there. He had worked for the same company for 19 years. He had started at the bottom, working site coordination right out of college, and had climbed steadily, methodically, without drama, to a role where he managed a team of 14 people and oversaw projects worth several $1 million. He was not a flashy man. He drove a 4-year-old Ford F-15, that he maintained himself on weekends. He coached his younger son's soccer team every fall. He mowed his own lawn on Saturday mornings, always in the same diagonal pattern, and his neighbors on Birchwood Drive in suburban Columbus knew him as the guy who would come over with a shovel before you even asked when there was a bad snowstorm. He was, by every conventional measure, a good man, a steady man, the kind of man that people describe at funerals when they want to say someone was genuinely decent without it sounding like a consolation prize. His wife was named Sandra. She was 48. She had grown up in Dayton, the daughter of a high school football coach and a middle school librarian, and she had that particular brand of Midwestern warmth that makes people feel immediately comfortable around her, the kind of woman who remembered the names of your children and asked about them months later, who brought a casserole when there was a death in the family, who organized the neighborhood 4th of July cookout every single year with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. She worked as a dental office manager, a job she had held for 11 years, and she was good at it. She was organized, personable, professional, and her colleagues genuinely liked her. Thomas and Sandra had met in their late 20s at a mutual friend's wedding in Cincinnati, a weekend wedding at a vineyard outside the city, the kind of event where the wine is good and the mood is loose and conversations happen between strangers that wouldn't happen anywhere else. Thomas had been seated next to her at the rehearsal dinner. He told me, when I spoke to him at length about all of this, that he knew within the first 30 minutes that she was different from anyone he had dated before. He said she made him feel both completely at ease and completely alive at the same time, which he admitted was a combination he had never experienced before and has not entirely experienced since. They dated for 2 years. They got married in the fall, at a small church outside Columbus, with 72 people in attendance. Their older son, Marcus, was born 2 years after that, and their younger son, Derek, came along 3 years after Marcus. By the time this story begins, by the time we reach that October night in the driveway, Thomas and Sandra had been married for 22 years. 22 years of mortgage payments and school pickups and vacations to the Outer Banks and arguments about whose turn it was to call the plumber and Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper and the particular comfortable silence that accumulates between two people who have spent 2 decades building a life together. And here is the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that I think is important to say before we go any further into what happened. Thomas was not a perfect husband. He would be the first to tell you that, and he did tell me that without being asked early in our first conversation. He worked long hours. There were seasons of his career, particularly in his mid-40s, when he was trying to secure a promotion, where he was essentially absent from the house in any meaningful sense, even when his body was physically present. He missed a school play, he forgot an anniversary once, and handled the aftermath badly. He was not great at saying the things that needed to be said, at having the conversations that required a certain emotional vocabulary he had never fully developed. He was, in other words, a real person with real limitations existing inside a real marriage, not a villain, not a saint, just a man who was doing his best and sometimes falling short in the ways that middle-aged American men so often fall short, quietly, without drama, without even fully realizing it. And Sandra, for her part, had her own interior life that Thomas only understood the surface of. She was social in a way that he was not. She needed connection, conversation, the feeling of being seen and heard and interesting to other people, in a way that Thomas, who could go days without much social contact beyond the professional, simply did not require in the same measure. For years, she had filled that need through her friendships, through her work, through the rhythms of community life that she genuinely loved. But somewhere in the years between Derek starting high school and that October night in the driveway, something shifted. Something that Thomas either did not see or chose not to look at too directly. And in that space, in that gap between what Sandra needed and what was available to her inside the marriage, another person found a way in. His name was Greg, and Thomas had known him for 6 years. It was a Tuesday in the second week of October. Thomas had been in Pittsburgh for a 2-day project review, the kind of routine site visit and contractor meeting that happened several times a year and rarely varied in any significant way. He had left Columbus early Monday morning, driven the 2.5 hours east on I-70, checked into a Hampton Inn off the highway, done his meetings, had dinner alone at a steakhouse near his hotel, and gone to bed. The plan, as Sandra knew it, was for him to finish his second day of meetings on Tuesday, stay a second night, and drive home Wednesday morning. That was the plan. But Tuesday's afternoon sessions wrapped up faster than expected. A contractor cancellation cleared 2 hours off the schedule. And by 3 o'clock, Thomas was sitting in a conference room with nothing left on his agenda and the sudden, clear possibility of getting home a day early. He thought about calling ahead. He actually picked up his phone, opened Sandra's name in his contacts, and then set the phone back down. He thought it would be a nice surprise. He was tired. He missed his house, and the idea of sleeping in his own bed rather than a hotel room held a particular appeal. He packed his bag, checked out of the Hampton Inn, and started the drive back to Columbus. He pulled onto Birchwood Drive at 9:47 in the evening. He knew the time specifically because he had checked his phone at a red light 2 blocks from the house to see if either of the boys had texted him. They hadn't, and the time was visible in the corner of the screen. What he did not expect, when he turned onto his street, was to see a car he did not recognize sitting in front of his house.